Okay, hi. Well, thank you very much for coming. And I'm not sure how you follow that and how one follows this. I'll start by showing this, which is a bottle of water that was given to me by, I think, River Action after their march in London when I started this commission. And it has water, I'm told, from all different parts of the country to be preserved. The team have been looking after it really carefully, and they assure me that this is the actual water I was given. So I'm going to present it to the Secretary of State at the conclusion of this report, so that it can be kept as a reminder in the department. So look, thank you for joining me today in this fantastic museum, one of the birthplaces of the British water industry, and one actually that predates the Victorian age. This is a Georgian building and a Georgian facility. The Grand Junction Waterworks Company was actually formed in 1811, while the Napoleonic War was still raging, to supply clean water, drinking water, from the junction of the Grand Union Canal, which had just been built in Paddington, to households in London. In need of cleaner sources of water, the Commission moved its operation to Kew, then outside London, in 1838, and built this magnificent pumping station with its huge steam engines to pump the water for Londoners. And as London grew and needed more water, the company grew and became more profitable, until in 1905 it was taken over by the Metropolitan Water Board, along with several other private water suppliers, to provide a unified supply system for London. The reliable supply of water that is clean and safe to drink, or to give it the description the Victorians put into law, and that we still use today, the supply of water that is wholesome, is a prerequisite of modern life, and it's something we become used to and take very much for granted. And the same is true of that other prerequisite of modern life, effective sanitation. 20 years after this pumping house opened, London experienced the Great Stink of 1858. After years of suffering a cesspit and sewer system that could not cope with London's growth, with the Thames a pestiferous and reeking abomination, to quote a newspaper at the time, the decision to close the cesspits, followed by a hot, dry summer, brought matters to a head. As the Thames became, to quote Disraeli, a Stygian pool reeking with ineffable and intolerable horrors, Parliament, literally disabled by the stench, woke up and finally acted. It gave clear direction to the newly formed London Board of Works, which in turn adopted the plan of its chief engineer, Joseph Bazalgette, and over the next 15 years, he oversaw the construction of 1,100 miles of sewers and massive pumping stations that transformed the health of London. Now, I have more than once thought of the Great Stink when leading the Independent Commission on Water over the last 9 months. While today we enjoy safe water and clean sanitation to a level that would have been unimaginable 165 years ago, there are many parallels. A system under huge pressure from economic and population growth, years of discussion and competing plans as the problem grew, a government that did not give clear direction, a level of pollution in our waterways that the public would not tolerate, and a point at which it became apparent to all that a fundamental reset was needed. And actually, there's a parallel in a bonus for Bazalgette that was blocked because it was deemed to be too high. It's true. Today, the Commission publishes its report, which I hope will contribute to that reset, the one the government has committed to and the one that we sorely need. The report is long and detailed, some 460 pages, with 88 recommendations, covering everything from strategic direction and planning to regulatory reform to the water industry supply chain. In an earlier speech, I paraphrased Tolstoy to observe that while we're all unhappy with the current situation, everyone is unhappy in its own way. And now, looking at the length and scope of the report, I wonder if we have written a Russian novel in response. But I would defend that length and that scope on 2 grounds. First, and most obviously, the terms of reference were set to ask the Commission to answer those questions, and that we have tried to do. But second, and perhaps more important, if we are to achieve the water sector we need to look at all the factors that have contributed to our Great Stink moment, and that factors that, if not addressed, will hamper us going forward. And the water industry, of course, is at the heart of this, and the industry as a whole has not met public expectations or maintained public trust in recent years. Some companies have manifestly acted in their private interest, but against the public interest. That must be prevented in future. But the industry does not exist in a vacuum. It sits within a framework of law and regulation that operates under the strategic direction of government, and is not the only demand on our water system or the only contributor to the current state of our waterways. The Commission's report is long and detailed with multiple recommendations because, as I've said, there is no one single reform, no matter how radical, that will deliver what is needed. We need to act on all of the failures that have brought us to the present past. Now, you'll be very relieved to hear that I don't intend today to go through all of the 460 pages. I am an ex-central banker, but I'll spare you that. All of the 460 pages and the 88 recommendations. But I will highlight, if you permit me, the main themes of the report and pull out some of the key recommendations. First, we need truly strategic direction from government. Now, barely a week goes by without someone calling for a strategy from government. So it's important I set out what I mean and the challenges it will entail. We need to guide the use and development of our water systems and to guide the restoration of our water environment as a whole and over the longer term. There are many competing demands on our water system. Demands to abstract water, demands to discharge into water, and demands to enjoy water for recreation. Only government can set the overall objectives for water and the timescale for achieving them. Only government can set the broad priorities, balance demands when they compete, coordinate the different elements of the system, and only government can decide who should pay and how much the nation can afford. It is relatively easy to set down a list of objectives. Effective strategic governance and guidance is much harder. It requires striking difficult balances, making difficult choices, and taking a long-term view. In the report, we recommend government in England and government in Wales produce a national water strategy. We set out in detail what it should cover, how it should be produced, and how it should be enshrined in statute to ensure consistent direction can be maintained over the longer term. I have no illusion that it will be easy to produce. To govern is to choose, but to govern is hard. But, as with the Great Stink of 1858, without such direction from the very top, we will not achieve the change we need. To connect that high-level strategy to action, we need to learn how to manage and plan for water as a system, or rather as a set of regional water systems. Our river basins, aquifers and coasts and demands upon them constitute complex systems, and they need to be managed as such. The water industry, agriculture, transport, local development, land use and environmental regulation all affect the regional water system and the water catchments that it comprises. As many respondents to the Commission have observed, we are very poor at system planning for water. There are huge, confusing and overlapping planning processes for the water industry, overseen by 4 regulators in a process that costs hundreds of millions of pounds. These plans drive water industry investment, but there are no processes equivalent driving action in the other sectors that have an impact on the water system. And those water industry plans are not connected to local government development plans or to local voices or those other sectors that also have an impact. Opportunities for local government, agriculture and water companies and other actors to work together are missed. Opportunities, for example, to implement sustainable drainage schemes that avoid stormwater overloading our sewers and causing sewage spills into rivers, or opportunities to balance the nutrient loads that cause such unsightly and destructive algae to bloom in water bodies. And heavy engineering concrete solutions to environmental problems are pursued despite local preferences for more natural solutions. Drawing on the experience from other countries, the Commission is recommending that regional water system planning authorities are established in England and a national systems planner is established in Wales. These would not be advisory bodies or talking shops. Rather, they would take over the role played by the Environment Agency and Natural Resources Wales at present, with real authority over water industry investment and real influence over other funding streams that can be directed and achieving regional water system objectives such as agricultural grants. To be clear, this would not be the creation of a new level of bureaucracy. Rather, it would bring existing functions together on a regional water system basis in England and a national basis in Wales. It would streamline existing planning processes. The current water industry processes will be streamlined into 2 plans, one for drinking water and one for wastewater. And most importantly, it would link local development to water system investment, avoiding the situations we see at present where housing and economic development projects are blocked because the regional water systems cannot cope with them. Alongside strategic direction and regional water system planning, the legislative framework for water is a key part of determining the overall framework for the management of water in England and Wales. And the current framework has driven considerable improvement in certain areas. Drinking water and sanitation standards are now world-leading. Bathing water quality has greatly improved. But the current framework is also complex, inconsistent and out of date and highly prescriptive. The Commission has therefore recommended that it be reviewed to bring the legislation up to date, particularly with regard to the Water Framework Directive, which sets those key high-level objectives for the environmental quality of water bodies. The Water Framework Directive sets a target to be achieved by 2027, and at a minimum, the review will need to consider what targets should be set for after that date. We recommend, however, that the government use the opportunity to consider the scope of the legislation. One area in which we see a strong case for change is broadening the scope of the legislation to include public health, given the increase in the recreational use of water in recent years. We recommend that in England and in Wales, the chief medical officers are asked to chair task forces to consider how to bring public health effectively into water quality legislation. Now, over the last 9 months, I have heard consistent criticism, not of the ambition of the environmental legislation, which must be preserved in any review, but about the inflexibility that requires and drives regulators to focus on narrow engineering solutions rather than being able to take a broader view of overall environmental and other benefits, for example, such as may be found in nature-based solutions. We recommend also that the review should make the legislation less prescriptive and provide for constrained discretion to enable regulators and local system planning bodies to take decisions in the round on how best to meet environmental objectives. Strategic guidance, systems planning and legislation, they can set the broad framework, but delivering the outcomes we want for water depends most importantly on having not just the right strategy, legislation and plans, it depends crucially on having the right regulators. Regulators that command public confidence and industry respect, regulators that have the capacity and the capability to do their job effectively. And most important in the Commission's view, in the same way as strategic guidance and system planning, a structure of regulation that can focus on the water system as a whole. Our assessment is that the current environmental and economic regulators have not achieved what is needed and will not achieve what is needed. There are many reasons for this. It's clear the Environment Agency has not had the resources, the people, the skills, the technology to hold the water industry and other sectors that impact the water environment to account, and that is beginning to change, I'm pleased to say. We're looking at and calling for reform of operator self-monitoring, moving from water company sampling to digitalised automated systems, ensuring real-time, accurate data. Crucially, this must sit alongside tightened enforcement of abstraction limits, sludge management and drinking water standards. And on the economic side, for much of the last 20 years, Ofwat was encouraged to regulate with a lighter touch and to focus on keeping bills down. And it didn't have the powers or the capability to supervise the financial structure of much of the industry, which allowed some companies and their owners to take decisions which reflected their private interests, but badly damaged both their companies and the longer-term public interest. We are seeing some of the consequences of that failure to defend the public interest in the news every day. I'll return later to this question of how, in an industry of private monopoly companies, the private interest could be brought into alignment with the public interest, and whether the regulator has the sufficient power to ensure that this happens. When the water industry was privatised, Ofwat was established to protect consumers from monopoly power by setting the prices that the water companies charge, and to incentivise investment and to create proxies for competition that would drive efficiency. In line with other privatised utilities, Ofwat's approach to regulation was built around econometric modelling of the notionally efficient company to provide the benchmarks for setting prices and for setting financial incentives and sanctions. And in the decades immediately following privatisation, investment and efficiency grew. The quality of treated wastewater and bathing water have improved. There's been a 41% decrease in leakage in England since privatisation, driven particularly in the 1990s. But in more recent decades, performance of the industry has plateaued, and the public goods demanded by the water industry have grown. In response, Ofwat has developed and intensified its use of econometric tools and industry-wide benchmarks. The Commission recognises the motivation behind this, but our assessment is that it has taken this approach beyond the limits of its effectiveness, and indeed to a point where it may have become counterproductive in terms of the performance of the industry as a whole and of its ability to attract investment. In the Commission's view, it is important to have an objective framework for setting prices and incentives based on modelled outputs and based on comparability between companies. But this approach alone, no matter how aggressively pursued, cannot drive the improvement of the sector to deliver the public goods that are necessary, nor to attract the investment that is now required. There needs to be a fundamental rebalancing of this approach to economic regulation and oversight of water companies, a rebalancing towards a closer, judgment-based supervisory engagement with individual water companies. This will require an equally fundamental shift in capability and also a shift in the regulatory culture, which, in the Commission's view, has become too adversarial on both sides. The Commission's report sets out how a new duty to supervise should be enshrined in statute, how a judgment-based supervisory approach might be implemented, and the expert capability in finance and in engineering that will be necessary. We also make several important recommendations as to how the price review process, which should be retained alongside and informed by supervisory engagement, might be simplified and reformed. These include changes to the framework for delivery incentives, the allocation of bill revenues to infrastructure renewal, which I will talk about in a moment, the calculation of the return on capital and on debt, and to the appeals process. While changes to economic regulation are necessary, however, they will not address the fragmented regulatory landscape of the water industry. Water companies' costs, investments, plans, performance are overseen by 4 regulators at present in England: Ofwat, the Environment Agency, Natural England, and the Drinking Water Inspectorate. Each has a different focus, different objectives, and different requirements that overlap and are often in tension. The Environment Agency determines much of the industry's investment needs, but the industry's revenues are determined by Ofwat. Companies can be sanctioned by both Ofwat and the Environment Agency for the same pollution incidents. Funding of maintenance and infrastructure renewal are the responsibility of Ofwat, but the environmental consequences of ageing infrastructure are the responsibility of the Environment Agency, as we saw in the report that was released last week. The regulatory structure of privatisation was set up with separate regulators. As the overlaps have grown and the environmental and other standards have been raised, the need for coordination and resolution of different objectives has grown. The Commission has not approached the option of major structural change lightly. It's never an easy option. I'm all too aware, after many years in the public services, the costs and the risks of breaking up and reforming institutional structures. And these costs and risks go beyond the financial. They include the human costs of organisational change, the deflection of management time and focus, the risk of dropping the ball on key objectives and of breaking up internal synergies, and the need to create new interfaces between organisations. The Commission has looked very hard at the potential for coordination mechanisms to address the tensions and overlaps we have identified. Our conclusion, however, is if the primary objective is securing the reset and long-term change that we needed in the water sector, we need an integrated regulator for water. The Commission recommends, therefore, that in England, Ofwat, the Drinking Water Inspectorate, the water-related environmental protection functions of the Environment Agency and of Natural England be brought together into a new integrated regulator for water. For Wales, which has a different institutional structure, we recommend that the economic regulatory functions now carried out for Wales by Ofwat be transferred to a Welsh economic regulatory function located in Natural Resources Wales. The new regulators for water will become responsible for Ofwat's current duties and roles to protect consumers. But in line with its terms of reference, the Commission has also looked at the broader arrangements for vulnerable customers and those for consumer redress and consumer advocacy currently carried out by the Consumer Council for Water. We have to recognise that the cost of producing water and wastewater services is likely to increase over the medium and longer term, as the industry has to replace ageing assets, respond to higher environmental and public health standards, and continue to adapt to the challenges of rising population growth and climate change. And against that likely background of rising costs and rising bills, there is a need for a stronger safety net for the most vulnerable who are exposed to water poverty. Water companies already operate social tariffs, spreading the cost of supporting vulnerable customers across their customer base. But the effects of higher costs of water in different parts of the country have different impacts, and there's already significant variation in the bills that vulnerable customers pay, even after taking account of local social tariffs. It's for government to decide how far and whether to equalise support for the vulnerable in different parts of the country, and it's for government to decide whether that should be done through water bills or through the social security system. But the government has now taken the powers to introduce a national social tariff, and in line with our assessment that stronger support will be needed for the most vulnerable, the Commission recommends that such a tariff be implemented. We make, however, no recommendations on the design, the level of support, and the degree to which there should be cross-subsidy between customers of different water companies. These are highly distributional decisions, and such decisions are not for technocrats, but for government to make. We also make a number of recommendations on consumer redress and consumer advocacy. On redress, unlike other regulated sectors, there is no mandatory dispute mechanism for water customers. The Commission believes that water company customers should have the protection of a statutory ombudsman, as exists, for example, in energy. And given the Consumer Council for Water's expertise in this area, the Commission recommends that it be upgraded to become the Ombudsman for Water, with citizens' advice, which has proved to be a powerful consumer advocate, taking over the role of consumer advocacy for water customers. In addition, changes we have recommended to the water company price review process will allow appeals against price determination to be brought by consumers as well as by water companies, again, as is possible in other regulated sectors. Taken as a whole, the changes the Commission proposes should lead to more effective joined-up regulation and stronger protection for consumers. In the Commission's judgment, if implemented effectively, they will address the shortcomings in regulation that lie at the heart of poor performance, underinvestment, and the failure to protect the public interest that we've seen. Regulation must be a key line of defence to protect the private interest. A system of private regulated monopoly utilities, as I've said, will only work if private interests of water companies and their owners are aligned with the public interest in the production of public goods. That's the job of regulation. But looking at the history of recent decades, water companies themselves and their owners must bear a major part of the responsibility for the failures we've seen. Water companies are private companies, and their owners are entitled to a return on their investment. But those returns must not come at the expense of the public interest. Water companies operate under licence, and the public purpose of their operations is inherent in those licences. Sadly, we've seen over recent decades examples in which companies have, as I said earlier, pursued short-term private interest at the expense of public interest and at the cost of the long-term resilience of their companies. A large number of the responses to the Commission's call for evidence expressed disquiet and real concern at the inclusion of the profit motive in the provision of water. And I do understand the concerns raised by many about profit in the provision of water, given some of the experiences we've seen. Some propose nationalisation or municipalisation or the transfer of for-profit water companies to not-for-profit models. The Commission considered these in line with our terms of reference, which focus on a privately owned regulated sector and rule out nationalisation or the purchase of companies with public funds for transfer to other ownership models. But we also examine the performance of different ownership and operational models, public and private, in other jurisdictions. We published our initial analysis of the call for evidence. We invited respondents to bring forward more evidence and analysis. We've refined our analysis and we published it in full in the final report. And I have to say, on the data and on the comparable metrics available, which are not strong, I admit, we did not see an evidence of a causal link between ownership models and a range of environmental and other performance indicators. And we took from this work two conclusions. First, as I've said, the regulatory model is key to performance, and we need to address regulation. But second, where companies are privately owned, it is the business model of the owners, the level of return they seek on their investment, their time horizon for that return, their preference for dividends or capital gain, and their willingness to invest further in their company for a fair return. Those are the things that make the difference. At privatisation, it was envisaged that water companies will be owned by long-term investors looking for relatively low-risk, low-return investment, as might be expected from a regulated monopoly utility. Investment vehicles have changed markedly since privatisation. Many investors, including institutional investors, now prefer private, unlisted ownership to listed ownership. It's the Commission's view that whether listed or unlisted, it remains the case that the industry and the public interest is best served by long-term, low-risk, low-return investors. The changes to regulation that we've proposed, particularly to economic regulation, are intended in part to lower regulatory risk and to reduce the variability of returns that deter such investors. The Commission has also recommended that the government make the stability of the regulatory system an objective in the National Water Strategy, and that maintaining the investability of the sector become one of the duties of the new regulator for water. But just as we need to attract longer-term responsible investors to the sector with more predictable regulation, we do need to ensure that owners and managers do not again act against the public interest or damage the financial resilience of companies. So the Commission is also recommending giving the new regulator the power, when necessary, to block changes of ownership, to set minimum gearing levels, and in certain circumstances to give direction to the ultimate controller of the company. These powers exist in other regulated sectors, and they are necessary guardrails in water. We are also recommending making the public purpose of companies clearer in their licence condition, bringing company governance in line with the governance code for listed companies, and bringing in for the very senior management cadre a statutory code drawing on some of the experience of the senior managers regime in the financial sector. Now, you'll all be pleased to see that I'm quite near the end, and I hope this won't seem like a Russian novel of a speech to go along with the Russian novel of a report. But the final area that I really have to talk about is the health of our water industry infrastructure and the resilience of our water and wastewater systems. We simply do not know the overall health of the system. Ofwat last oversaw a full assessment 20 years ago. The asset health measures used in price reviews have been backward-looking, measuring past failure rates to determine and fund the amount of capital maintenance and renewal necessary to keep the system operating. Much of water industry infrastructure is underground and very difficult to assess, and different companies have different ways of assessing asset health. Not all water company assets are mapped. We do not know whether enough replacement and renewal has been funded and carried out in the past, but there is strong evidence that we may be considerably behind the game. When the Scottish regulator switched from using backward-looking indicators, similar to those that Ofwat have used to a forward-looking, in-depth assessment of asset health and requirements, the conclusion was that there had been material underfunding of capital maintenance. Other countries replace and renew infrastructure at much faster rates than we have maintained. And as we heard last week from the Environment Agency, infrastructure failure is a major reason for the pollution incidents we are seeing. So the Commission is recommending that a forward-looking assessment of our infrastructure is carried out and that national resilience standards are developed for water, which can then inform regulation and the funding of the industry going forward. Now, the massive steam pumping engines, and there's a fantastic bigger one through there that you really have to look at before you leave. They operated for over 100 years and were retired only when steam gave way to diesel and to electricity. And actually, the very big pump next door, I'm told, was kept available on the network until the 1980s, just in case it was needed. Now, a couple of weeks ago, I visited a much more modern pumping engine hall, just over 50 years old, filled with electric pumps that supply drinking water to 1/3 of Londoners. It is a single point of failure for the water supply for all of Canary Wharf, and it is on its last legs. A £400 million project to replace the entire facility has finally been approved, and work is about to begin on a replacement. But given the limited space and the need to keep the facility operating, it is a hugely complex project that will take at least 7 years. Now, I raise this example not merely to contrast the standard of Victorian engineering with its more modern successors, absolutely humbling though that is. It's also an example of the forethought, timescale, planning and funding necessary to ensure that our water infrastructure continues to serve us into the future, and of the dangers of a patch and mend approach. I started this speech with the Great Stink of 1858 and the reset it triggered. Change didn't happen overnight. It took Bazalgette over 15 years to complete its sewer network and for London's health to be transformed. I very much hope, following our own Great Stink moment, that the recommendations in the Commission's report will launch the reset that is required. And likewise, change will not happen overnight, and trust will take time to come back. But I hope we are now at the beginning of that road. Finally, it's been a real privilege to lead this work, and as I conclude the Commission and bring it to a close, which I think formally happens immediately after the speech, I'd like to thank the Commission Advisory Group, many of whom are here today, and who've helped us with their insights and their wisdom. And finally, I want to thank the Commission Secretariat, the amazingly committed and hard-working Commission Secretariat team for all they've done. Any credit for this report goes to them. The criticism stays with me. Thank you. I think I have to answer questions. Are we on to questions? Or? Yeah, very happy to answer questions. I'm going to have to put some glasses on so that I can just see who is talking. Yeah,
thank you. Sir Jon, Paul Kelso, Sky News. Just looking at your report, I note your comments about water bills rising. But looking at the report, you say you've heard evidence from the companies saying that investors simply don't believe they're getting a big enough return. So is it the case that investor returns are going to have to rise, and that's one of the reasons bill payers are going to be paying more?
So investor returns have a long and checkered history in this industry. They've been very high and they've been very low. Certainly over the period to 2023-24, they were pretty low. And for some companies, the return the investor got was less than they would have got by investing in government bonds. So there is an issue about the level of return for investors. But you know, there's also an issue about the variability. And all the investors I talked to said, we are happy to accept a lower return. We're not looking for those high returns in water if you can give us lower risk on the downside. But if you make this industry a higher risk, higher reward industry, you'll not only have higher costs, okay, but you will also attract investors that have different business models and maybe aren't the best ones for the industry. So yes, I think looking relative to 2019, 2023, you'd expect returns to be higher. You certainly wouldn't expect to have investors losing money relative to gilts. But looking back on over previous periods, they might be lower. It's that variability and the dispersion of returns between different water companies. Some water companies have done pretty well, but others have got trapped in poor performance. So yeah, bills will have to reflect what investors need, the equity they need. That's part of the cost of building the infrastructure that we need. But at the same time, a regulator needs to continue to maintain pressure on efficiency. I just believe they can do that, not just with a modelled approach, but just with a deeper, more structural engagement with water companies. Oh, go on.
James Wallace, River Action. Thanks, John.
I did keep the file, James.
Thank you very much for carrying it with you and for undertaking the commission. Special administration, there's some myths that need busting in the room. I might like to suggest that the value of water companies is pretty much zero if they haven't maintained their roof and let sewage run on the ground floor. So this idea that it would cost billions to buy off Thames Water funders, for example, I wonder what your position is on that. We don't see much about the special administration regime in your report. Thank you. Okay,
so first of all, the report is about the changes to put water on the next path. Nothing in the report reopens PR24, and we're not dealing and didn't look at individual cases like Thames. So I think we haven't got an opinion from the review about what should happen to Thames or not, or what the value of the Thames assets is. And we haven't valued water companies and their assets. I know what's recorded in the national accounts, and that which is actually larger than the RCV, and I know what the regulated capital value is. But sorry, James, we didn't value water companies, and those questions I think need to be pursued with others rather than the Commission. We did look at the special administration regime, and we looked at it in a number of respects. First of all, the question of the triggers. There were lots of requests or suggestions that the triggers be more automatic, be linked to certain indicators. I have to say I have a strong personal opinion here as somebody who's been involved with the resolution and failure of banks over a number of years, which is that one should not set mechanical triggers for something like resolution or special administration, because what you discover, and I have discovered this, is the future never turns out to be quite what you imagine it will be. You need judgment, unfortunately, and there's no substitute. So we looked at the triggers, the way they were expressed, the degree of judgment that's in them, and the conclusion we came to that the triggers were right. They didn't need to be changed, and that means that the authorities responsible for a SAR, or determining a SAR, will have to make judgments and will have to be accountable for those judgments. But I think that's the right way to go. We also looked about whether the practical difficulties of a SAR actually made it difficult to pursue. And there, again, taking what I learned during the financial crisis and afterwards, you need to prepare for the possibility of SAR. So I don't want to go into the whole panoply of living wills that we have in the banking system, which are a cost on the system. But you need to know that if I have to do a SAR, how will I operate it? What will happen to the contracts? Who can take them over? How can it be smooth so that customer service is not impacted, and so the ownership can be changed, and if necessary, the debt and equity written down to make the customer viable, because that's what a special administration regime is about. And we make some recommendations about how water companies need to do the planning for that, not because we expect them to go into a SAR, but because the authorities need to be able to approach a SAR on its merits without worrying about what do I do the day after, because I don't really know how this company would operate. So we do make some recommendations in that area. Oh, I'm going to go to the very back, because the back always gets discriminated against.
Thank you. Lucy Heath from the iPaper. I wanted to ask about sewage spills. We saw over the weekend Steve Reid promised that he was going to bring sewage spills down by 50%. and I think water companies have already said a similar figure. Do you think these reforms could speed up that process and that we could see that happen more quickly?
So we haven't, let's just say the Commission didn't take a view on the speed of particular changes in terms of infrastructure. What I'd say is that the last price review, PR24, had double the amount of investment going into the water industry. And we're seeing a level of environmental investment which is 4 times what we saw in the preceding period. I think it's about £25 billion. And your question, and a lot of that, I think 6 or 7 billion, is directed at improving storm overflows by 2030. And if your question is, can that go faster? I go back to where I finished about forethought, planning for the longer term. There is a limit to how fast you can build. There is a limit, as we discussed, I didn't talk about it today, to what the supply chain can produce. If you suddenly gear up investment, from 6 billion over 5 years to 25 billion over 5 years, you have to look at where the supply chain, the people, the expertise, materials will come from, particularly at a time when water is not the only infrastructure sector that is being renewed. So I don't know whether the plans there can be speeded up. I do know that the Environment Agency has said that if the plans that are in PR24 are completed, the water industry will have materially completed what it needs to do to meet the Water Framework Directive's objectives on water quality. That's wider than sewage spills. That's about the ecological and chemical quality of water generally. So there will be progress. There. But that, of course, would expose the other sectors that damage water quality, particularly agriculture, and we shouldn't forget that, and we need to find ways to address it. Let's go over here in the orange.
Thank you. Hi, it's Jo Osborne. I'm from Waterwise. At the weekend, I visited Kinder Reservoir in the Peak District, and it was looking incredibly low. I've seen a lot of very low reservoirs in my time. So I'd just like you to speak to the water efficiency recommendations you've made, because there is real need for us to take action now on reducing demand across the UK, and that's something for all organisations, I think, to focus on, not just the water sector alone. Okay,
so water demand and changing water demand, I think, is an important part of ensuring that we have the water, the water that we need. Some of that goes to obvious things like metering, and we talk about extending compulsory metering further than the areas which is needed at present. But some of it actually goes to not just convincing us all to use less and nudging, which is important and works, but it goes to how we use water. So 20% of water goes to industrial use, and the 7 big oil refineries are the major users within that bracket. And they take drinking water that's been purified at high cost, and they spray it on their tanks to cool them. The problem is they actually have to treat the drinking water to take out some of the purifying agents to make sure they don't contaminate the tanks. And then they take that water and they put it back into the sewer system, okay, where it adds to the volume going through an already overpressed system. And you have to think, why is that happening? Well, some of that is tariffs. There's a falling block tariff, as it's called, which means the more you use, the less you pay. But some of it is also because we haven't produced and incentivised the grey water systems that we need for industrial use and in households. And we are going to have to do that. We recommend actually that standards for using grey water or water that's purified to a certain level, good enough for the garden, good enough for heating, etc., but you wouldn't drink it, to actually develop those systems for housing. There are some regulatory barriers. The Drinking Water Inspectorate are required to make sure that water companies can only produce water that's fit for drinking. So it's quite difficult for them to produce water that's of a different standard for other purposes. We need to think about how we use buildings and how we provide for those 1.5 million new homes that we're intending to build. There's a range of solutions that we talk about, but you're right, it's an extremely important part of the problem. I'm going to go over here because I've been unfair to this side of the room. Yeah, we'll go to you next. If that's okay.
Thank you. So, Kate Jennings from the Association for Consultancy and Engineering. So, thank you for engaging with us during the process. You highlighted the risk of regulatory change, changing governance. And I just wondered whether you had any advice for government on how to ensure that scaling up of investment happens, notwithstanding the regulatory changes.
So I think if I could split the question in two parts, we do need to ensure the investment happens. One of the changes that Ofwat made after the kind of review on moving to outcomes-based regulation was not actually to assess whether outputs had been constructed. And look, there's a good motivation. It's more efficient to say, are you producing the outcome, rather than did you build specifically the thing you were going to build. But there are ways of producing the outcome short term that aren't sustainable in the long term. And there are 18,000 lines of environmental investment in the WINEP. We don't expect the Environment Agency or Ofwat to be able to check every one of those 18,000 lines. But the assurance that the bulk of the investment that was planned was built was dropped, basically. And as a result, we don't know. We just don't know what happened. So going forward, ensuring that that investment happens, I think is the job of the regulator and will be part of the integrated regulator. And integration helps because Ofwat doesn't do any inspections, but the Environment Agency does inspect, but they inspect to see whether the asset is doing what it says on the permit, rather than whether the asset is falling apart, or will fail in a couple of years. The second part of the question, though, is much more difficult, which is how do you ensure that major regulatory change, which is what we're recommending, doesn't result in the ball being dropped and key things being lost. And that's happened. And many mergers and structural changes fail on IT systems, on management load. But it's not impossible. And there are examples of it happening. And we mentioned Ofcom, which brought 6 regulatory agencies with very different cultures and objectives together, and which the National Audit Office have singled out for one of the most successful regulators or regulated industry and content that we have. So these things can be done. They require intensely good leadership. They require continued attention. There are difficult human problems that take time to resolve. I've been involved in when the FSA was wound up and the PRA came back to the Bank of England. I was involved in that. I know how difficult it is and difficult it is to the culture. But it can change and it can be done. It's not easy, which is why we spent a long time looking at this before we said, no, we have to bring this together to get the regulation that we need. But it won't be an easy job, and my sympathy goes to those who will have to do it and lead it. But I really do think it's a change that is necessary. I said over here, I need to go for gender parity as well. It's really complicated nowadays.
Robert Smith from the FT. Your report sets out the need for regulatory forbearance, such as deferring fines, waiving fines in a turnaround regime. As it happens, Thames Water's senior bondholders are currently lobbying for regulatory forbearance as a condition of recapitalising the company. Should we read your report as an implicit endorsement of that demand?
No, I don't think so. You shouldn't read my report to say anything about what one should do with Thames, but you should read my report to be saying how we avoid ever being in that situation again. But I don't think so. What the report says is that there will be circumstances in which that is in the public interest, but it also says that there are circumstances where what is required is disproportionate and is not in the broader public interest to give that forbearance. And there will be circumstances in which, no matter what forbearance you think might be possible, actually you don't think the company is recoverable and you need to go straight to the administration regime. I hate to come back to this word, and maybe it's because I'm very old-fashioned, but judgment matters. But there are times when, in order to pursue something, you actually make the problem you're trying to fix worse. And in the end, whether it's in the interest of the bond, or the shareholders of Thames have lost their money anyway. So if we're thinking about moral hazard, then speak to the university superannuation scheme, and they will tell you about moral hazard. And we're thinking about the bondholders, and some of those know they're taking a haircut already. So the question becomes, viewing this in the round, because the law has been broken and broken in a big way, what is the right thing where you stand? And I can't say what the right answer is for Thames. I do think, though, we need to have that ability to take that decision and to take it much earlier than one might face it with Thames at the current juncture, because sometimes it'll be in the public interest to do that. Okay, I'm going to just go over here, and then I'll come to you. Two more? Okay.
Thank you. Stuart Singleton-White from the Anglican Trust. First of all, thank you for the recommendation of a single water regulator. We called for this in our 2021 broken water report, so it's good to see this coming through. But I'd like to focus on the environmental ambitions that you mentioned with the proposed reform of the Water Framework Directive and your comments around bringing in public health benefits. Rivers, first and foremost, are should be ecologically functioning units. That means clean water, plenty of water, and healthy habitats. How do we make sure that in the bringing in of public health, we don't overemphasize the clean water aspects for recreational purposes, and we do ensure that the absolute healthy functioning ecosystem remains the priority within that framework?
So that's a great question. And I started this work, because I have no background in the, apart from 9 months in my first job in the civil service. More years ago than I care to remember, I have no background in water or the water industry. So I started making assumptions that all of the environmental and public health interests lay on one side and the economic interests lay on the other side. But what I've learned is actually that when you think about the uses of water, you have to balance different objectives. And certainly turning all of our rivers into swimming pools is not going to deliver what we want. But I talked about, so this is maybe where I differ. I think you're right, there are some overriding objectives in water, primarily on top of the list, the supply of drinking water, because our society depends upon it. But the others are balances that have to be balanced and recognised, and that's what that national water strategy is about, and that's what the local regional planners are about. And they have to balance the interests of different groups who value different things in the water environment and different economic sectors. I talked about the oil refineries, but who need to use water in a different way. And those are decisions that we take in society all the time. The issue for the review was not to say it's this rather than that. I haven't said that. The issue for the review is that those decisions are taken transparently. They're taken by the people who should take them. I come back to government, local authorities, regional planning, catchment groups who actually use the water that kind of is at the end of this. And they should be honest and recognise what the trade-offs are. And I think one of the reasons we are where we are is that hasn't happened. The trade-offs have happened. Somebody in one of the round tables I had told me off, I think it was an environmental round table, for using the word trade-off, and I betrayed my Treasury heritage. But those trade-offs and balances happen. They're not avoided. The difference is, do they happen in a way we can see, we can influence, we can recognise, and authorities that we give the power to determine these things do that, or do they just fall out of the system in a haphazard way? And I think we're very much in the latter world, and we should be very much in the former. So how many more can I take? I could take one more, so I'm going to go here if I might. Oh, just, it's only because I can hear you easier.
Hi, it's Helena Horton here from The Guardian. How long do you think it should take for the new regulator to get set up, this new super regulator? And does it need new leadership?
So, I don't know how long it will. We didn't go through an implementation plan. We did look at the issues, the synergies that would get broken, the people that would have to move. We engaged with the regulators and asked them to explain what the cost would be. People have different views. We took a judgment in the end on what was needed. We looked at Ofcom which took 2 years. Some of it depends on how fast legislation can be introduced, because you can do things before legislation, but actually you need the legislation to come in. And it was 2 years to bring the regulator together. I'm under no illusion that there isn't a whole tail of culture and systems that have to happen after that. But the Ofcom one was 2 years, the Bank of England, PRA, bringing that into the Bank of England was about 2 years to get the major change in and the new institution functioning. And then, of course, there's a lot more to do. Leadership, this sort of thing requires very high-level leadership, but it requires also, it will require a sort of balance of skills and expertise that we don't have at the moment because the regulators aren't set up in that way. So I'm leaving government, Minister, with a lot of problems, for which I apologise. But these are some of the issues the government will have to tackle going forward. Okay. All right, look, thank you very much. Can I just advise you all, last piece of advice from the Commission, is go and see the engines. It really is magnificent. Thank you.